podcast offered by Uksim Planetary Service Centre. The consciousness and the cosmos, a path to one's own inner cosmos. There are many myths about the Atlanteans. Were they able in reality to sustain a harmonious and equilibrated life? Was there unification of the consciousness? Daniel Gagliardo answers, no. For unification to be considered unification, it must be in harmony and in equilibrium. There were continuous wars in Atlantis. In any case, we can define that there was a bastion that was stronger than the rest. But if they were continuously at war, it means that there was something that was not unified. No, there were no settlements where there were no colonies. There was nature in different degrees, magnitudes or manifestations. Because the Atlanteans not reached the numbers that we incarnating beings have today. We beat all the records. The Atlanteans were infinitely smaller in terms of the number of incarnating beings, which does not detract from the value of their civilization. It means that it fulfilled its role as an evolutionary karmic experience on the surface of the Earth. It complied with the corresponding evolutionary correlation, but it did not reach the overflow that we have reached today and the ease with which we expand across the planet as we do today. The Atlanteans, despite how brutal they were not as toxic and polluting as we are. Where it is synonymous with the expansion of our humanity to the furthest reaches of this planet, at least within its reach. Fortunately, moving to other levels with damage, danger, or extinctions of minerals, vegetables, and animals, something that the Atlanteans were not so toxically impactful on life, although they did cause disaster. We have been spoken more than once about the genetic experiments they carried out, about Atlantean genetic magic, about Atlantean astrogenetic magic. They did not impact the planet as we are impacting it. Why? Precisely because of something that worked against them on one hand, but works in the other favor on the other hand, which was the emotional aspect that, when faced with certain issues, became excited, became shocked, and emitted a certain type of feeling. We have a disastrous emotional body, but a flawed rational mind. So for us, even though our emotional body did not reach maturity and it is disaster, the mind, precisely because of its identification with the emotional body that is so toxic, reached a degree of absolutely selfish reasoning that made us much more dangerous than they were in their direct impact with the patterns that we can today with current language called socio-environmental. Question from the audience. Did the Atlanteans use nuclear energy? Daniel Gagliardo answers, no, they did not use nuclear energy. There was only one stage. They did not use it throughout the entire Atlantean evolutionary curve. There were even other post-Atlantean civilizations that were part of what we might call Adamic arc, which did use nuclear energy. Hierarchically speaking, we were not allowed to know their names, where on the planet they were located, their population densities, their customs, beliefs, etc. We are not allowed to know anything. The only thing we were allowed to know, that the hierarchy allowed to know, to our knowledge, is that they existed and that use of nuclear energy. Let us always remember that from the sinking of Atlantis to the present day, millions and millions of years have passed, not thousands of years. And we have a historical consciousness that does not exceed 12,000 years, 1,000 at most. The rest are all your assumption. We talked about Egypt. We talk about Egypt. We talk about Syrians, the Chaldeans as very ancient civilizations, as if to say, well, beyond that, the rest is speculation. However, we are talking about civilizations that are more than 1 million years old, that we have no records of, and no way of finding records of. Why? Because the consciousness of the planet and the hierarchy that watches over it as a tool of planetary consciousness did not allow us to access the vestige of those civilizations. But it did allow us to access the hierarchy as a millstone within the framework of instructional energy, and thereby destructive examples. Allowed us to know that they existed and that among some of their negative qualities and conditions, rather than qualities, was their profuse use of nuclear energy. The purification that took place was that, as a result of this use, some became so aware that their consciousnesses expanded, and they were gradually taken to the interterrestrial levels to join more advanced civilizations that were already responding to the evolutionary experience under internal laws of the planet. Others tried to join their civilization but eventually returned to the surface of the earth because they could not adapt. So the possibility that was given to them was, well, in light of what they experienced, did it serve to transform them? Did it serve to understand certain aspects of the truth or not? Some yes and others no. So according to the hierarchy of instruction, they are symbolized in the rays of the east, in the yellow rays of the east. Those who returned from the small experiences of attempting to be in contact with the inner laws, and according to the hierarchy, the possibility was closed for them. They had the margin to return to the inner levels, which at the beginning was not to directly immerse themselves in the interterrestrial laws, but to have an experience of underground energies adaptation, breaking their contact with the external world. They were given the karmic opportunity to adapt to an interface between the surface of the planet, between the surface laws of the planet and the internal laws. Some who were able to adapt and pass through were gradually migrated to the internal laws. The others left. They were given a margin, and then the doors of access to the interface were closed to them. They were left out directly. They could not longer return. Question arises from the audience. Were they evolved civilizations? Daniel Gagliardo says, yes, of course, of a certain evolution, because to speak of evolved civilization is not to speak of the same degree of evolution, but of civilizations that no longer had the evolutionary need to be under the law of karma, because there are interterrestrial civilizations that are less evolved than those we know. But their degree of evolution, despite responding to the internal laws of the planet, is not sufficient to assume contact with us. From that contact become a sufficiently effective voltage of radiation and conduction for our consciousness. So contact with this civilization is preserved, even though they were not under the law of karma, so to speak. This is just an example. Take it with a pinch of salt. It is as if our future surface civilization were preserved from coming into contact with beings from the surface of the karmic planets, who are sufficiently evolved. But because we are in an earthly stage of high evolutionary law, we would not be able to assist them. Here, more or less, the same thing happens, but in reverse. Interterrestrial civilizations that are no longer under the law of karma, but whose evolutionary trajectory is not as extensive as the Earth's or the others we know, are therefore exempt, so that they can continue to deepen their contact with more advanced subterranean civilizations. They're exempt from contact with a civilization as primitive as ours because they do not need it, nor do they have the conditions to assume such contact. They are in a learning process under a higher evolutionary law, but at a specific level of learning. I exempt those beings, which means I suppress them, because in reality there are many more of us who lived through the terror of Nagasaki and Hiroshima than the group of those who were initially present and could not assume the interterrestrial path. That is, they were a minority in relation to this. Let us not forget that we are talking about beings who are already part of the post-Atlantean period. At that time, it was a small bastion of humanity, while humanity as a whole, with its generalized pattern of behavior, opened the door to nuclear energy. So, They received what they had to receive from that. Although, if you ask why the Japanese who received that of the yellow race, it could be that yes. Atlantis, the central island of Atlantis, was approximately, because the entire geography was different, but in terms of energy, it was approximately where the Sargasso Sea is today, in North Atlantic, in the Atlantic Ocean of the Northern Hemisphere. The shape of the planet was different, but to give us a rough idea, there were increasingly expanding groups of islands. So, from the Azores to the Canary Islands, the Atlantean stronghold existed completely, and to the north and south there were also groups of islands, or very isolated islands that no longer exist today, very separate, which were also Atlantean colonies. So the geography was different, but to give you an idea, although it was centralized in one place, as we moved away from the motherland, the same as in Lemuria, we find increasingly isolated colonies that could be used as karmic strongholds to experience different things from the motherland. But they were interconnected by the same pattern of behavior, by the same genetic and racial pattern. So the planet had a different format. The density of the planet in terms of population density was different, which is why we say that we generate an aberrant overpopulation on the planet. The Atlanteans did not have the population density, so everything was different. We have to understand something. If we understand ourselves as a rational matrix, being post-Atlantean or Adamic, we are like an ant-hill everywhere. We do not have to see Atlantis strictly as its central island, or Lemuria as its central island. The planet had a different constitution, but the diversification, the breadth, the propagation of the Atlanteans on the planet existed. It is not that the planet was small or empty and they had no discovered. No, the Atlanteans' experience was different precisely because experiences are not repeated. But the planetary universe in which they did so was planetary universe that they had to colonize and populate, just as we currently populate the post-Atlantean universe. The possibility of gestation is based on karmic uses. The ability of beings to bring children into the world with the minimum amount of errors The copulation birth equation today is extremely high. In Atlantean period, the copulation gestation birth ratio was much lower. In the Pacific, Lemuria was like an extension of a civilization that had its center in the Pacific and Indian Ocean. Within the Pacific, it had a central Pacific region and another in the Indian Ocean, close to each other, forming a kind of crescent shape that stretched from the Indian Ocean to the central Pacific. Many of the supposed islands of the Pacific, of Polynesia, according to what the hierarchies revealed at some point, are ancient remains of the energy of Lemuria. At the time of Atlantis, Africa was not connected to America, as scientists say, because otherwise Atlantis could not have existed, since Atlantis was in a place where, if we connect Africa in America, there is no longer any room Atlantis. Their areas of influence, nothing more. Today, we said that in the same way that we expanded and are present as the Adamic race throughout the planet. Tiahuanaco and all those places were areas of influence, but not as we know them today. And all these ruins are not Lemurian because there were no Lemuria ruins left. But yes, it was an area of influence because at the time Lemuria existed, the Andes did not exist. Yes, but not as a central stronghold, but as an area of influence, because Tiahuanaco was specific constructions that are post-Atlantean. Only they are part of the bastion of civilizations of which we have no evidence. The only evidence we have of that civilization that formed Tiahuanaco and all its influence, that is what we see there, we have nothing else. The entire area of Bolivia and Peru was within the framework of that civilization. A collection of quotes featuring insightful recordings of Daniel Gagliardo's teachings, the founder and instructor of Cosmosophy line Uksim. recorded during Cosmosophy gatherings held across Europe and in the serene landscapes of Uksim, Argentina. In these meetings with Daniel Gagliardo, stimuli and concepts from inner life are made available to the attending public. The different themes arise from questions provided by those attendees, thus allowing for a valuable dynamic of communication and instruction. The acceleration of the apex of the planetary transition offers in these talks tools of synthesis intended for those individuals or groups whose fate and intention to transform confirm their adherence to the cosmic order that will soon be restored on the planet.